It all started with what was supposed to be a chill weekend trip. Me, Emma, and Jason heading out to this cabin that Jason's uncle had out in the middle of nowhere. Jason had been there a few times before when he was younger, and he always said it was a cool spot to just get away. No phone signal, no neighbors, just woods for miles. It sounded perfect for a weekend escape. But from the moment we hit the highway, things just started feeling off. We'd been driving for hours, and the sun had already set. The GPS went out, and the last stretch of road was pitch black, winding through the thick forest. The kind of dark that makes you feel like you're the only thing alive for miles. Jason was at the wheel, gripping it so tight his knuckles were white. I guess I wasn't the only one feeling the tension. "Are we there yet?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice a little shaky. I could tell she was trying to hide how freaked out she was. "Yeah, we're close," Jason muttered, but I could tell by the way he said it that he wasn't sure. He kept glancing down at the dashboard, then out at the road like he was trying to remember something. The GPS had lost signal about 30 minutes ago, and now we were just relying on Jason's memory. The guy had been here before, but it was years ago, and everything looked different in the dark. "I don't know, man," I said, staring out the window at the rows of trees flying by. "I feel like we missed a turn or something. It doesn't look right." Jason let out a frustrated sigh. "It's fine, okay? I know where we are." But the way his voice tightened at the end told me he wasn't as confident as he wanted us to believe. The deeper we drove into the woods, the more isolated it felt. The road turned to gravel, and the sound of the car's tires crunching over rocks echoed in the eerie silence. No other cars, no lights, just us. A thick fog started to roll in, swirling around the trees and making the air feel heavier, like it was pressing down on us. "Okay, this is creepy as hell," Emma said, leaning forward between the seats. "I thought this was supposed to be a fun trip. This feels like the start of a horror movie." I forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. "Yeah, all we're missing is the creepy old guy warning us to turn back." Jason shot me a look. "Relax, it's just a forest. We'll be at the cabin in a few minutes." But something wasn't sitting right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone or something standing there just out of sight. But every time I looked, it was just shadows and fog. Still, I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. Finally, after what felt like forever, the cabin came into view. It was old, way older than I expected. The wooden beams were worn, the roof sagged in places, and the windows were dark and empty, like black holes staring out into the woods. It sat at the end of a dirt path, surrounded by thick trees that loomed over it, almost as if they were trying to swallow it whole. "Here we are," Jason said, a little too cheerfully as he pulled the car to a stop. "Told you I knew where we were." We stepped out of the car, and the cold hit us immediately. It was colder than it should have been for this time of year. Emma hugged herself, looking around nervously. "This place looks, I don't know, worse than I thought. Didn't your uncle ever take care of it?" Jason shrugged, grabbing the keys out of his pocket. "He hasn't been here in a while. It's fine though. The inside's probably better." The front door creaked when Jason unlocked it, and we stepped inside. The air was thick, stale, like no one had been there for years. The smell of damp wood and dust filled my nose, and I had to hold back a cough. The place was a mess. Furniture covered in white sheets, dust coating everything. And in the corner of the living room was this old, faded painting of a man I didn't recognize. His eyes seemed to follow us as we moved around the room, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Okay, this place is officially giving me the creeps," Emma said, glancing around. "It feels weird." Jason rolled his eyes, but even he looked a little uneasy. "It's just an old cabin, Em. Relax. We'll clean it up a bit, make a fire, and it'll be fine. You'll see." But I could see it in her face, and I felt it too. Something wasn't right here. There was a heavy feeling in the air, like we weren't supposed to be there, like the cabin was waiting for something. As we unpacked, the sense of unease only grew stronger. The woods outside were silent, too silent. No birds, no animals, nothing. Just the occasional creak of the old house settling, or the wind howling through the trees. "You guys feel that?" Emma whispered after a while, her voice barely audible. "Feel what?" Jason asked, looking up from his bag. "I don't know, like someone's watching us." Jason forced a laugh, but it didn't sound convincing. It's just your imagination, Em. Let's just get settled, and everything will feel better in the morning. But as I looked around the dark cabin, with its dusty furniture and that creepy painting staring at us, I wasn't so sure. And deep down, I knew that whatever this feeling was, it wasn't going away anytime soon. And we had no idea what was waiting for us in the days ahead. The cabin looked worse up close. The weathered wood was cracked and discolored from years of neglect. The windows were smeared with grime, and the porch creaked under our feet like it might collapse at any second. It was one of those places that felt frozen in time, like it had been abandoned long before we even got there. The closer I got to it, the more the unease in my stomach grew. I helped Jason and Emma carry our bags inside, and as soon as we stepped through the door, a musty smell hit us all. The air inside was thick and heavy, like it had been sitting stagnant for years. Dust particles swirled in the thin beams of moonlight that squeezed through the dirty windows. Every surface was covered in a layer of dust, so thick you could write your name in it. Emma wrinkled her nose. It smells like something died in here. Yeah, probably a few things, I muttered, glancing around the room. The furniture was all old, like it had been left to rot just like the cabin itself. An ancient-looking couch sat against the wall, the fabric worn and discolored. There was a fireplace in the corner, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. Jason threw his bag onto one of the chairs and looked around, clearly trying to keep things light. All right, it's a little rough around the edges, but come on, it's got character. Character? It's got mold, Emma shot back, rubbing her arms like she was trying to shake off the feeling of the place. I wandered further into the living room, my eyes drawn to that weird painting again, the one of the man with dark eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in those historical photos from centuries ago. His expression was unnerving. His mouth was set in a thin, stern line, and his eyes, God, those eyes, looked too real, almost like they had been painted to watch anyone who entered the room. You think that's supposed to be someone in Jason's family? I asked, pointing at the painting, trying to make light of it, but failing miserably. Jason shrugged. Maybe. My uncle never said anything about it, but he never cared about stuff like that. Probably just came with the place. Well, it's creeping me out, Emma muttered, dropping her bag on the floor. That thing belongs in a haunted house. I couldn't argue with her. The whole place had a vibe I couldn't shake. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Jason ignored the tension. We'll get a fire going, crack open some beers, and it'll be like a real cabin vacation. Trust me, by tomorrow, you won't even notice the dust. I wasn't so sure about that. The longer we stood there, the more it felt like the cabin itself was watching us. Emma didn't seem convinced either. She was pacing a little, glancing nervously out the window every few seconds, as if expecting to see someone or something lurking in the trees. Hey, help me with this fire, Jason called to me, already trying to light up some old logs in the fireplace. Let's get this place warmed up. I nodded and walked over to help. As we worked to get the fire going, I could hear Emma moving around the room, poking at things, opening cabinets, clearly uncomfortable. Why is there no electricity? She asked, flicking a light switch by the door. Nothing happened. Jason grunted as he blew on the small flame we'd managed to coax from the wood. Uncle Tom said it was out the last time he was here. Power lines must have gone down a while back. We got a generator somewhere, though. Somewhere. I raised an eyebrow. You don't know where? Jason stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. It's probably out in the shed. I'll look tomorrow when it's light out. Tonight, we're roughing it. Camping style. Emma rolled her eyes. Great. Should have packed a tent. Jason shot her a grin. Come on, you're tougher than that. Emma wasn't buying it. I didn't sign up for some survivalist weekend, Jason. I thought we were coming to a cabin, not some death trap in the middle of the woods. Jason's grin faded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was trying to play it cool, but I could tell he wasn't as confident as he'd been earlier. This wasn't exactly the nostalgic getaway he'd been picturing either. With the fire finally going, we sat down in the living room. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls, making the cabin feel even more eerie. The painting of the man seemed to watch us from its spot on the wall, his eyes glinting in the firelight. Emma was still on edge, fidgeting with her phone, which had no signal. I don't like this place, guys. Something's not right here. Jason leaned back, trying to keep things light. You're just freaking yourself out. It's an old cabin in the woods. What did you expect? We'll clean it up tomorrow, and everything will feel better. But I knew what she meant. That feeling I'd had on the drive. The sense that we weren't alone. It hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now. There was something off about this place, something I couldn't explain. The air felt too heavy, the shadows too dark. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it. A soft, distant creak, like wood groaning under weight. It came from somewhere deeper in the house, beyond the living room, maybe upstairs. The three of us froze. Jason glanced towards the hallway, trying to act casual. It's an old house. Wood settles, you know? Emma's eyes were wide. That didn't sound like settling. It sounded like footsteps. I opened my mouth to say something reassuring, but before I could, we heard it again. Another creak, louder this time. Definitely not just the house settling. It was deliberate, like someone or something was moving upstairs. Jason stood up, trying to look braver than he probably felt. I'll go check it out. It's probably just something fell over. Emma grabbed his arm. Don't. Let's just stay here. He hesitated, then sat back down. Fine. We'll check in the morning. But I knew none of us would sleep easily tonight. Not with whatever was upstairs or whatever was watching us from those dark corners. Waiting, the fire crackled, filling the silence, but the unease remained. We managed to get the fire going strong, and after a few beers, things started to feel a little less tense. At least for a while. The cabin wasn't so bad with the flames flickering, filling the room with warmth. Jason cracked a few jokes, trying to keep the mood light, and Emma started to relax, she was still jumpy, her eyes constantly darting to the windows like she was expecting something to pop up. I couldn't blame her. I felt the same way. The shadows outside seemed too still, like the forest was watching us, waiting for something. I'm telling you, tomorrow we'll clean this place up, and it'll be great, Jason said, leaning back in his chair, sounding more confident than he looked. You guys are just freaked out because it's dark. Everything feels creepier in the dark. Emma glanced at the fire, clearly unconvinced. It's not just the dark, Jace. This place, I don't know. It feels wrong. Jason shrugged, not really responding. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt it too. I could see it in the way his eyes kept flicking towards the hallway that led to the upstairs rooms. Something about this place was getting to all of us. We ended up calling it a night early, mostly because there wasn't much else to do. With no power, no phone signal, and only the fire to keep us company, the options were limited. Jason grabbed a flashlight and led the way up the creaky wooden stairs to the bedrooms. The house was eerily silent, aside from the occasional groan of the wood settling. Or at least, that's what we kept telling ourselves. The upstairs hallway was worse than downstairs. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed deeper, more suffocating. There were 3 rooms, one at the far end, the master bedroom, and 2 smaller ones off to the side. Jason claimed the master, of course, and Emma and I took the smaller rooms. See you guys in the morning, Jason said with a half-hearted smile, trying to act normal as he disappeared into his room, the door creaking shut behind him. Emma lingered outside my door for a second, her voice low. You feel it too, right? I nodded, not bothering to lie. Yeah, something's off. She bit her lip, then forced a smile. Well, good night. If anything weird happens, wake me up. You too, I said, and we both went into our rooms. My room was small, just a single bed and a dusty dresser against the wall. The window was cracked open slightly, letting in a faint draft that made the curtains flutter in the cold breeze. I closed it, but even then, the room felt too cold, too silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in there. I lay down, pulling the thin blanket over me, trying to get comfortable, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the house groan and creak. Every little noise felt amplified in the silence. The wind outside, the rustling of the trees, the crackle of the dying fire downstairs. But after a while, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I stayed still listening, but there it was again, Slow, heavy footsteps coming from the hallway. I sat up, my heart pounding, staring at the door. The footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. My first thought was that it was Jason, maybe going to the bathroom, but something about the way the steps echoed in the silence felt wrong. Too deliberate, too heavy. "Jason?" I called out, but my voice was barely a whisper. No answer. The footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting. My heart was thudding in my chest, so loud I was sure whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, even though I knew it wouldn't help. No signal, no help, just me and the darkness. For what felt like forever, there was nothing, just silence. I started to think maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the house settling, or the wind, and then I heard it, a whisper, low and raspy, right outside the door. "Leave!" The voice was so faint, I almost thought I had imagined it. But no, it was real. It was right there, just beyond the door. I froze, not daring to move, not even daring to breathe. I strained to hear it again, to make sure it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. "Leave now!" This time it was clearer, more insistent. My heart pounded harder. I jumped out of bed, my body trembling as I grabbed the flashlight Jason had left me earlier and crept toward the door. My hand hovered over the handle. I didn't want to open it, but I needed to know. I needed to see if there was someone or something on the other side. I took a deep breath and yanked the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Cold, dark, and empty. I stood there, staring out into the blackness, waiting for something to move, for something to explain the voice I'd just heard. But there was nothing. I stepped out into the hall, the floor creaking under my feet. The cold air wrapped around me, sending a chill down my spine. My flashlight's beam cut through the dark, but all it showed were the same dusty walls, the same old wooden floorboards. I walked down the hall, towards Jason's room, half expecting him to jump out and tell me this was all some kind of messed up prank. But when I got to his door, it was shut tight, and the faint sound of his snoring drifted through. Jason was asleep. I went to Emma's room next, knocking softly. "Emma," I whispered. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. After a moment, the door creaked open, and Emma's pale face appeared in the crack. "What?" she asked, her voice groggy but with a nervous edge. "What's going on?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you hear anything?" "Like footsteps." Her eyes widened. I thought I was dreaming, but yeah, I heard something, like someone walking outside my room. "Me too," I whispered, my voice barely audible. And I heard a voice. Her face went pale. A voice? What did it say? It told me to leave. We stood there in the dark for a moment, just staring at each other, neither of us sure what to do. I could see the fear in her eyes, and I'm sure she saw the same in mine. Finally, Emma whispered, "What the hell is going on in this place?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever was happening, it wasn't just in our heads. The house was alive. The next morning, we all tried to act normal, but the tension hung in the air like a thick fog. None of us slept much, if at all. Jason didn't mention hearing anything weird, but I could tell from the dark circles under his eyes that he didn't sleep easy either. Emma was quieter than usual, nervously sipping her coffee and staring out the window into the thick forest. I couldn't get the sound of that voice out of my head, or the feeling that someone had been standing right outside my door. Jason was trying to keep the mood light. "We need to stop creeping ourselves out. We're just letting the whole old cabin in the woods thing mess with us." He flashed a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. Emma didn't say anything, just nodded absently, still staring into the trees. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. Sitting in that cabin, surrounded by dust and silence, was making me feel like the walls were closing in. Emma and Jason agreed to come along, more out of the need to get some fresh air than actual excitement. The forest around the cabin was dense, thick with tall trees and undergrowth. The kind of place where you could get lost if you weren't careful. The path Jason remembered from his last visit was barely there anymore, overgrown and swallowed by the wilderness. We walked in silence, the crunch of leaves and twigs under our feet the only sound. It felt good to be outside, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was worse. Are there any other cabins around here? Emma asked after a while, breaking the silence. Jason shook his head. Not for miles. This place is pretty isolated. That's why my uncle loved it. Peace and quiet. Emma didn't look convinced. She kept glancing over her shoulder, like she was expecting something, or someone, to be following us. We hadn't gone far when I spotted something up ahead through the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no, it was definitely a person. A man. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, just a few yards away, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He just stood there, staring at us. "Hey, you see that?" I whispered, stopping dead in my tracks. Jason squinted, then froze when he spotted the man too. Emma followed our gaze, her eyes widening. "Who the hell is that?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. The man didn't look familiar. He was tall, his face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a different time. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and from where we stood, his eyes seemed wrong. Too dark, too deep. "Maybe he's a neighbor," Jason suggested, though his voice wavered. He didn't believe it either. There weren't supposed to be any neighbors. The three of us stood there, unsure of what to do. Should we call out? Wave? Go back to the cabin? My instinct was screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from this guy as possible. But Jason, ever the brave one, took a step forward. "Hey, can we help you?" he called, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond. He didn't even move. He just kept watching us like he was sizing us up. Jason took another step forward. "Are you lost? This is private property, man." Still nothing. The man just stood there, as if he hadn't even heard Jason. But I knew he had. His head tilted slightly, just enough to let us know he was listening. His eyes were locked on us, unblinking, like he was waiting for something. Or maybe watching for something. "We should go," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right." Jason hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, let's head back. We'll talk to him if he comes any closer." But the second we turned our backs, something strange happened. The air got colder, and I swear I could hear a low whispering. Not from the man, but from the woods themselves. It was like the trees were talking, murmuring something just out of reach. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emma looked at me, wide-eyed. "Hear what?" Before I could answer, Jason glanced back over his shoulder. "He's gone." I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The man was nowhere to be seen. The clearing where he had been standing was empty, just trees and shadows. There was no way he could have moved that fast without us hearing him. He had just vanished. "That's not possible," I muttered, staring at the spot where the man had been. He was just there. Emma grabbed my arm, her voice shaking. "Let's go. Now." None of us argued. We hurried back to the cabin, our footsteps faster than before, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see that man again, standing in the distance, watching. But he never showed up. The forest was empty. When we reached the cabin, we bolted the door behind us, as if that would keep out whatever was lurking out there. Jason paced the living room, running his hands through his hair, his expression twisted with confusion and something close to fear. "Maybe it was just some local," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "Maybe he's a hunter or something. There's gotta be an explanation." But I could tell he didn't believe it. None of us did. Emma stood by the window, peeking through the curtains. "I don't think he was human," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I turned to her, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, looking pale and scared. "I don't know. He didn't feel right. Like he wasn't supposed to be there." Jason stopped pacing and stared at her. "What are you saying? You think we saw a ghost or something?" Emma didn't answer. She didn't need to. The fear in her eyes said it all. I glanced at the old painting on the wall, the one of the man with the dark, haunting eyes, and suddenly, I couldn't help but wonder. The man we'd seen in the woods, there was something about him that reminded me of that painting. The same cold stare, the same unsettling presence. But that was impossible, right? Just a creepy coincidence. That's what I told myself. Anyway, still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever, or whoever, was in these woods wasn't just a local. There was something else going on here, something we didn't understand, and somehow it felt like we had been drawn into it, like we were being watched, not just by the man, but by the forest itself. The whispers in the trees, the cold that lingered even in daylight, the way everything seemed to shift and move when we weren't looking. I didn't say any of this out loud, but I could tell Emma was thinking the same thing. And Jason, well, he was trying to stay rational, but I could see the cracks forming. He was scared, whether he wanted to admit it or not. We spent the rest of the day inside the cabin, too nervous to go back into the woods. Jason kept the fire going, even though it was daylight, and we tried to distract ourselves with food and small talk, but the silence between us was heavy. No one mentioned the man in the woods again, but his presence hung over us like a dark cloud. We all felt it. By the time night fell, the fear had settled deep in my bones. Whatever was out there, it wasn't finished with us. Not yet. Night came faster than any of us expected, the sunlight fading from the cabin like it was being swallowed whole by the thick, looming forest outside. The strange man we'd seen earlier in the day was still on my mind, and from the way Emma kept pacing around the living room, I knew she couldn't stop thinking about him either. Jason was trying his best to act normal, throwing more logs on the fire and talking about how we should just stick it out, but there was an edge to his voice. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all felt the same thing. We weren't safe here. Around 9 p.m., the power generator finally sputtered to life. Jason had gone out to the shed earlier and managed to get it working, but even with the dim lights flickering on, the cabin still felt suffocating. The walls seemed too close, the shadows too deep, and the silence too heavy. Every creak and groan of the old house made me flinch. Emma was sitting by the window again, staring out into the dark, her face pale and drawn. I knew she was looking for the man we'd seen earlier, wondering if he was still out there, watching us. I didn't blame her. I kept glancing out the window too, half expecting to see those dark eyes staring back at me from the trees. "Guys," Jason said suddenly, breaking the uneasy silence. He was standing near the fireplace, holding an old, dusty piece of paper in his hand. "I think I found something." Emma and I both looked up. "What is it?" I asked, sitting up straighter. Jason walked over to us, holding the paper out. It was yellowed with age, the edges frayed and torn. "I found this behind the couch, under a pile of firewood. It looks like a map or something." I took the paper from him, and Emma leaned over to get a better look. It wasn't just a map. It was a layout of the cabin. The lines were hand-drawn, old and faded, but still clear enough to make out. There were detailed sketches of every room, every wall, and every floor. "Why would there be a map of the cabin?" Emma asked, her voice filled with confusion. "Not sure," Jason replied, "but there's something else. Look here." He pointed to a section on the map that marked the living room. There was a faint scribbled drawing of a staircase leading down, a staircase that wasn't anywhere in the cabin that we'd seen so far. "That's got to be the basement," I said, frowning. "But there's no basement," Emma argued. "We've been all over the house." "Maybe not that we've seen," Jason said, glancing around the room, "but it's got to be here somewhere. Look, it's marked right under this spot." We all stared at the area he was pointing to, the far corner of the living room, where a pile of old firewood was stacked haphazardly against the wall. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now, looking closer, I could see a faint line running along the floorboards, almost like the outline of a hidden door. Emma's eyes widened. "No way." Jason grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and walked over to the firewood. He started moving the logs aside, his breath coming out in heavy puffs as he worked faster, his excitement, or maybe nervous energy, taking over. Emma and I stood back, watching in tense silence. After a few minutes, Jason stopped, standing up straight, his flashlight pointed at the floor. There it is. Sure enough, under the pile of wood was a small, square trapdoor. It was old, the wood worn and discolored, with rusted metal hinges that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. There was a thick iron ring in the center, meant to pull the door open. "Should we?" Emma started to say, but her voice trailed off, leaving the question hanging in the air. Jason didn't wait. He grabbed the iron ring and yanked the door open with a grunt. The wood creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the cabin. The door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into complete darkness. A cold draft rushed up from below, hitting us in the face like a sudden gust of wind. The air that came from the basement was thick, damp, and smelled like mildew and something else. Something metallic, almost like rust or blood. I stepped closer, peering into the darkness below. I don't like this. Emma shook her head, her voice trembling. We should close it. This is a bad idea. But Jason was already on the first step. Come on, don't be such wimps. It's just a basement. Every old house has one. We don't need to go down there, Emma argued, but it was clear Jason wasn't listening. I exchanged a glance with Emma, and despite every instinct in my body screaming at me to leave it alone, I found myself stepping forward, following Jason down the stairs. Emma hesitated for a moment, then followed behind us, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended, and the air grew colder with every step. The narrow beams of our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, revealing old wooden walls and thick cobwebs that clung to every corner. I could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere far below, the slow, steady drip echoing in the silence. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a large, open room. The floor was made of packed dirt, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with old, rusted tools and decaying pieces of furniture. It looked like no one had been down there in decades. Jason swung his flashlight around, his voice low. This is insane. I had no idea this was here. Neither did your uncle, apparently. I muttered, looking around nervously. Why would he never mention it? Maybe he didn't know, Jason said, moving further into the room. Emma stayed close to me, her hand gripping my arm tightly. We should go back. There's nothing down here we need to see. Jason ignored her, shining his flashlight along the far wall. Hold on, there's something here. He walked over to what looked like an old wooden crate, half buried in the dirt. It was large, almost as tall as a person, with thick iron chains wrapped around it. The crate looked ancient, like it had been sealed up and forgotten about for years. Jason knelt down, running his hands over the chains. What do you think this is? Don't touch it, Emma said, her voice high with panic. Jason, seriously, let's just go. But Jason was already prying at the chains, trying to loosen them. The metal creaked and groaned, but the chains didn't budge. He grunted, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Damn, these things are tight. Help me with this. No way, I said, stepping back. We shouldn't mess with this. Whatever's in there, it's been locked up for a reason. Jason rolled his eyes. It's just an old crate. What are you so scared of? Before I could answer, there was a sound. A low, scraping noise coming from somewhere in the basement. We all froze, our flashlights shaking as we turned towards the sound. It was coming from behind the crate. Something was moving back there. Did you hear that? Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart racing. We need to go? Now. Jason stood up slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. I don't know, man. It could just be. Suddenly, the crate shifted. It was slight, just a small movement, but enough to make the chains rattle. I felt my blood turn to ice. Something was inside the crate, and it was trying to get out. Emma screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards the stairs. We need to go. Now. I didn't argue. Jason hesitated for a split second, staring at the crate, then turned and bolted up the stairs behind us. We scrambled back into the living room, slamming the trapdoor shut and throwing the firewood back on top of it as fast as we could. We stood there, panting, our backs pressed against the wall, the fire crackling softly in the fireplace. The silence in the cabin was deafening. For a long moment, none of us said a word. Finally, Jason broke the silence, his voice shaking. What the hell was that? I don't know, I said, still breathing hard. But whatever's down there, it doesn't want us here. Emma nodded, her face pale. We need to leave. Now! And for the first time since we got there, Jason didn't argue. We didn't sleep much after the basement incident. The whole cabin felt different now, more alive, more hostile. Every creak in the floor, Every gust of wind outside sounded like a threat. We sat in silence for hours, huddled near the fire, listening for any sound that might come from the trapdoor. It didn't open again, but the tension hung heavy in the air, like we were all waiting for something to happen. It was close to dawn when Jason finally broke the silence. He stood up, pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "We can't just sit here doing nothing. We need to figure out what the hell is going on." Emma, who had been staring blankly at the dying fire, looked up. "What do you suggest?" "We leave. That's the smart thing to do." Jason shook his head. "I don't know if we can. The storm's picking up again." He nodded toward the window, where the wind was howling louder, and thick clouds had begun to roll in. The forest outside looked even darker than usual, almost suffocating. "We'll leave as soon as it's light," Jason said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. "But first, I want to see if we can find anything else. There's got to be a reason this place feels like this." "We already know enough," Emma said. "Something's wrong here. Why push it?" But Jason wasn't listening. He grabbed his flashlight and started rummaging through an old chest by the fireplace. Dust flew everywhere as he pulled out random items: old blankets, yellowed papers, and faded photographs. Finally, he pulled out something that made him freeze: a bundle of letters tied together with twine. "These look old," he said, turning the bundle over in his hands. The paper was crinkled and brittle, the ink faded, but still readable. He sat down on the couch and carefully untied the bundle, spreading the letters out on the coffee table. Emma and I exchanged a glance, but curiosity got the better of us. We moved closer, sitting on either side of Jason, staring down at the letters. They were addressed to Jason's uncle, Tom, but they were from someone we didn't recognize. The first letter was dated over 10 years ago, long before any of us had been up to the cabin. It started innocently enough: small talk about life in the countryside, how the cabin was a peaceful escape from the world. But the tone changed quickly. August 12th, 2013. "Tom, I hope you're doing well. Old friend, I'm writing you again because I haven't heard from you in months, and I'm worried. You mentioned seeing someone near the cabin. Do you still think it's just a hunter or someone passing through? I've been up there enough to know that nobody goes near those woods unless they've got a reason." You said he didn't speak, just stood there watching. "That's not normal, Tom. You need to be careful. I've been thinking about the history of the place, and I'm not sure I believe the old rumors. But then again, every legend has a bit of truth in it, doesn't it? Let me know what's going on. If you need me, I'll come up there, but for the love of God, don't try to deal with this alone. John?" Emma shivered. "Someone else saw him. The man we saw in the woods." Jason nodded, but his face was tight with concentration as he read through the next letter. This one was from a few months later, and the tone had gotten darker. November 3rd, 2013. "Tom, you still haven't written me back. What the hell is going on up there? I went by the cabin a few days ago, but you weren't there. The place looked like it had been abandoned for months. I checked the woods around it, but I didn't see anyone. No sign of the man you mentioned. Are you okay? Is he still bothering you?" I did some more digging into the history of the cabin. It's worse than I thought. There were disappearances up there, Tom. Not just in the old days, but recently too. People went missing in those woods, never found. You need to leave that place. Don't stay there alone. I'm serious. John, a chill settled over the room as we read. Jason's uncle had never mentioned anything about this. Never said a word about a strange man or anyone bothering him near the cabin. Why would he keep something like that secret? "We need to stop reading these," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't helping." But Jason ignored her, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up the next letter. This one was different. It was stained, the ink smudged like it had been handled too many times. It was dated 2 years ago, long after Jason's uncle had supposedly stopped visiting the cabin. June 15th, 2021. "Tom, I came by again. You weren't there, but the door was open, and I let myself in. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but I found something you need to know about. There's a basement in the cabin, isn't there? You didn't tell me that. I found it by accident, hidden under the firewood. I went down there. I shouldn't have. Tom, you need to leave. The man you saw, he's not just a person. I saw something in the basement. There are things down there, old things, that shouldn't be disturbed. I don't know if you've been down there yet, but for your own sake, don't go. Whatever is in that crate, whatever sealed up, it's not meant for us. The woods, they're different now. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like something is moving out there, watching. I'm leaving town for good. I suggest you do the same. John." The letter ended abruptly, as if John had been in a hurry when he wrote it. Silence fell over the room. The fire had died down, leaving us in a cold, dim light. None of us spoke for a long time, but the weight of what we had just read pressed down on us like a heavy blanket. The letters had confirmed what we already feared. There was something in those woods, and something in that basement, that we shouldn't have disturbed. Emma finally broke the silence, her voice barely audible. "He saw it. Whatever's down there, Jason, we need to leave." Jason rubbed his face with both hands, looking pale. "I know. Why didn't my uncle ever tell me any of this? Why didn't he warn us? Maybe he didn't want to believe it," I said quietly. "Or maybe he thought he could handle it." Emma stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "I don't care why he didn't tell you. We need to get out of here. Now." Jason stood up too, but there was a hollowness in his eyes. "We should have left when we first saw that man. But it's too late now, isn't it?" I didn't want to admit it, but I felt the same. The cabin didn't feel like just an old building anymore. It felt alive, like it was watching us, waiting. The letters had been a warning, and we hadn't listened. "We'll pack up and leave at first light," Jason said finally, his voice filled with determination. "Whatever's going on here, we're not staying to find out." But as he said the words, something crashed in the distance, loud and heavy. It came from the direction of the basement. The three of us froze, staring at the trapdoor under the firewood. The chains were rattling. The crash from the basement echoed through the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of chains rattling. The three of us froze in place, our breath caught in our throats. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound, the faint crackling of the dying fire and the increasing howl of the wind outside. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Jason grabbed the flashlight, his face pale and drawn. "I'll check it out," he muttered, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. "No, you won't," Emma said sharply, grabbing his arm. "We're not going back down there. We're leaving. Right now." Emma's right, I added, my voice just as unsteady. "We already know something's wrong down there. We don't need to go looking for more trouble." Jason hesitated, glancing at the trapdoor. The wood creaked, as if something beneath it was shifting, waiting. His grip tightened on the flashlight, but he nodded reluctantly. "Fine, we'll pack and go. But if that thing down there gets out, we won't be here to find out," I interrupted. Without another word, we scrambled to gather our things. The air in the cabin had grown colder, almost freezing, and the wind outside was picking up fast, slamming against the windows with such force that I thought they might shatter. It wasn't just a breeze, it was a storm, and it was closing in fast. Emma stuffed her things into her bag with shaky hands. How did this storm come out of nowhere? It was clear earlier, wasn't it? "Let's not think too much about it," Jason replied, grabbing his coat. "Let's just get the hell out of here." As soon as we opened the door, a blast of icy wind hit us full force, nearly knocking us off our feet. The trees swayed violently, their branches creaking and groaning like they were alive, bending toward the cabin as if trying to keep us there. Leaves whipped through the air, and the sky had turned a deep, swirling gray. There wasn't a single star in sight, just darkness and the roar of the storm. Jason stepped out first, bracing himself against the wind. "We'll head for the car. It's only a few hundred feet." But when I looked toward the car, my stomach dropped. The ground was already soaked, and the dirt road that led back to the main road had turned to mud, thick and slick. The car itself was barely visible through the sheets of rain that had started pouring down, a wall of water blocking our view. Worse, the trees looked like they were moving, really moving. I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else, but it felt like they were shifting, closing in around us. "We're not going to make it," Emma shouted over the howling wind. Her voice was panicked, and I could see the fear in her eyes. "We'll get stuck out there?" Jason hesitated, looking back at the cabin. The storm was getting worse by the second, but so was the threat from below. It felt like we were trapped between two dangers, and there was no safe option. The chains rattled again from the basement, louder this time, and a deep, rumbling noise echoed from beneath the floorboards, as if something huge and heavy was stirring. "We can't stay here," Jason shouted, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "We'll be trapped if that thing gets out." Suddenly, a massive gust of wind slammed into the side of the cabin, and I heard the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. One of the shutters was ripped clean off, crashing into the trees beyond. Rain poured in through the broken window, and the air inside the cabin grew even colder, as if the storm was trying to force its way in. The fire in the hearth sputtered and died, leaving us in near complete darkness. "We're going back inside," I said, grabbing Emma by the arm and pulling her toward the door. "We'll barricade ourselves in, just until the storm passes." "But the basement," Jason started, but I cut him off. "If we try to leave now, we'll never make it to the car. You saw the road, it's a swamp out there. We have no choice." Reluctantly, Jason nodded, and we all hurried back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind us. The wind howled louder, and the rain pounded against the walls like a relentless drumbeat. The cabin felt like a fortress under siege, and I wasn't sure how long it would hold. We quickly moved to block the trapdoor, piling firewood, furniture, anything we could find on top of it. It wasn't much, but it made us feel like we were doing something. I could still hear the faint sound of chains rattling from below, but it wasn't as loud now. Maybe because the storm outside was so deafening. Jason wiped the rain from his face, looking more rattled than I'd ever seen him. "Whatever's down there, it's been locked up for a reason. I don't think it can get out unless we help it." "Then why is it getting louder?" Emma whispered, hugging herself. Her voice trembled, and I could see her breath misting in the cold air. "I don't know," Jason admitted, "but we just have to make it through the night. The storm can't last forever." But as the wind howled and the trees groaned outside, I wasn't so sure. The storm seemed unnatural, like it wasn't just a coincidence. It felt summoned somehow, like it was here to keep us trapped. Hours passed, though it was impossible to tell exactly how long. The power flickered, then went out completely, leaving us in darkness except for the dim light of our flashlights. The storm raged on outside, relentless. The wind slammed into the walls again and again, and the windows rattled in their frames like they were about to shatter at any moment. I glanced at the trapdoor. It was quiet now, eerily so. Whatever had been stirring down there wasn't making any noise. The silence from the basement was almost worse than the noise. What if it's not the storm keeping us here?" Emma said suddenly, her voice low and shaky. "What if the thing in the basement, what if it's controlling the storm?" Jason shook his head. "That's crazy." "Is it?" I asked. "You read the letters. The man in the woods, the disappearances, the basement, none of this is normal. This storm isn't normal." Jason didn't respond, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't want to admit it, but we all knew something was wrong, something beyond our understanding. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. We all jumped, turning toward the sound. The door leading to the back of the cabin had been blown open, rain pouring in through the gap. Jason grabbed his flashlight and stepped forward cautiously. "I'll close it." But as he moved toward the door, we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from just outside. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart started racing. The footsteps weren't coming from inside the cabin. They were coming from the porch. Jason stopped in his tracks, shining his flashlight toward the door. The light bounced off the rain-slicked floor, but we couldn't see anyone. "Who's out there?" Jason shouted over the wind. "Show yourself." No answer, just the footsteps moving closer. Emma grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "It's him, the man from the woods." Jason took a step back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. No, that's not possible." But the footsteps kept coming, slow and steady, until they stopped right at the doorway. For a moment, everything went still. The storm, the wind, even the rattling chains from the basement seemed to pause, as if holding their breath. And then, a figure stepped into the doorway. It was the man from the woods. He stood there, drenched in rain, his pale face shadowed under the brim of his wide hat. His dark eyes glinted in the faint light of Jason's flashlight, unblinking cold. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there staring at us. "What do you want?" Jason demanded, his voice shaking. The man said nothing. He only raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed at the trapdoor. Jason's face went pale. Emma let out a small gasp, gripping my arm tighter. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "What's down there? What are you?" The man didn't answer. He just kept pointing at the trapdoor, his eyes never leaving ours. And then, in a voice so low it barely cut through the howling wind, he whispered 2 words. "Let it out." The lights flickered again, and in that split second, the man vanished, leaving only the storm behind him.